Just in case you're wondering what happened, all I will say is that working with the Jean-Francois Roger Wheat collection can be... No, I'm just kidding. Good morning. My name is David McKnight. I'm the director of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, and I sometimes masquerade as the curator of manuscripts here. You will hear many words of thanks throughout the day, I'm sure, but I would like to acknowledge the support of the Walter J. Miller Trust, which has generously provided the Penn Libraries with funding to support the acquisition of the phenomenal Jean-Francois Roger Wheat collection. Thank you, Walter J. Miller Trust. Thank you, Jean-Francois and Roger. I would also like to mention that in 2 weeks, we will launch the complimentary exhibition celebrating the 10th anniversary of Penn's own and unique common press, which will be a glow-in-color letterpress printing in the Kamen Gallery, which is on the first floor of the Van Pelt Dietrich Library Center. Like the symposium, we will be holding a similar symposium on the Common Press on April 20th of this year. Later in the program, Matt Neff, one of the artists, co-conspirators, and mentors of the Common Press, will be on the panel on teaching in session 4. So you'll learn more about the press and its activities. So for those of you who are local, I would encourage you to keep the date for the 20th, and we will be launching the exhibition in about 2 weeks' time. Since there are only 2 speakers this morning in this session, I will introduce the speakers separately and we'll hold questions to the end of Russell's talk. Our first speaker this morning is Daniel Desimone, who has been the Eric Weinman Shakespeare Library since January 2013. Previously, he worked as the curator of the Lessing J. Rosenwald collection in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division at the Library of Congress, where he organized symposia, presentations, publications, and exhibitions, including the notable exhibition, A Heavenly Craft, the woodcut in early printed books. Before his appointment as Rosenwald curator in 2000, Mr. Desimone operated his own New York-based bookselling business for 22 years. Focusing his business on selling books to rare book libraries, he developed specialties in the history of printing, antiquarian bibliography, book illustration, and 18th century Italian and French books. In 2006, he was awarded the Krasnov Grant, which funded research on the history of printing in Ferrara. And in 2005, and again in 2008, he received the Library of Congress Special Achievement Award. Recognition of his peers in both the United States and Europe, and elected a member of the Grolier Club New York, Association Internationale de Bibliophiles Paris, or Paris, and Print Council of America. Mr. Desimone holds an MA in American History from the University of Dayton and a BA in European History at University. The title of Mr. Desimone's paper is Color Printing in Early Printed Books. Please welcome Dan Desimone.
Top one. Good morning, everyone, and it's great to be here and to be part of this program. I'd like to thank Lynn and Jean-Francois and Will Knoll and the Kislak Center that has brought so many interesting speakers here today and for mounting such a timely exhibition. I'm very happy to have been asked to speak about early color printing. As well, when I was a curator, it was a subject that had come to me after years of studying the books in the Rosenwald collection at the Library of Congress and making acquisitions to fill gaps in the holdings of the illustrated book collections in the Rare Book and Special Collections Division. So this comes as a that I was able to get back to thinking about a subject that I've had very little time to deal with since leaving the curatorial ranks to work at the library, the Folger Shakespeare Library. Getting back into the saddle, so to speak, has given me a boost, and for this reason and no other, I thank you for providing me a lifeline to revisit a subject I love and to think about something other than budgets and facility problems and security. I became interested in color printing while working on a collection that Mr. Rosenwald formed. When I first began to study Blake, I really didn't understand him, and I didn't like his work particularly. And it literally took me years of looking at his relief etchings and comparing them with various examples and reading about his life before I began to understand the creativity and the unique manner in which he expressed his art. This really began in earnest when the Library of Congress purchased the archive of Michael Phillips, an engraver and historian of William Blake, who spent the last 30 years attempting to reconstruct his methods and techniques. Michael's archive, I began to understand how Blake printed his books and the way he applied color to highlight the text he prepared. At the same time as this was happening, I was invited to consult on a project on chiaroscuro color printing that was organized by Linda Moranis of the Library of Congress and Naoko Takahatake of the National Gallery of Art, now at the LA County Museum. They wanted to experiment with the process of color application and see if they couldn't contribute to a better way of making attributions of authorship for the many under-attributed and potentially wrongly attributed chiaroscuro prints that were in institutional collections. So the experiment began with Linda, who made the inks that were used in this process, and to Naoko, who used her knowledge of how the process worked and to produce a series, and the two of them produced a series of 2 woodblock chiaroscuro prints that were printed in numerous ways in order to determine how printers produce different results. They were printed on different paper, some were dry, some were wet. They used different pressures that were applied to the blocks. And Linda prepared a series of inks that were used to test how they reacted under these different circumstances. Peter Parker of the National Gallery and I were enlisted to be witness to this process, to ask questions about it, to discuss the evidence that was gathered, and Linda and Naoko took it from there. After having these experiences, I decided to look back at the history of color printing and see if my education in the process of printing that I learned from Michael and Naoko would help me better understand the challenges of printing in color and the efforts that printers were made to replicate through a mechanical process the arts of drawing and painting with color. What I prepared in this brief overview, very brief overview, I hope to be able to set the tone so that when Russell follows, we can understand what he's talking about, and for other speakers who will be following today. Before I go on, I just want to talk about this book very quickly. It's a new book that came out. I don't have an essay in it, and I have no financial investment in it. But it's a book on the history of color printing from 1400 to 1700. And if you're interested in the subject, it'll become a Bible for you, I'm sure.
What's the title?
Printing Color, 1400 to 1700. And it's up here if you want to look at it later, I guess. So I want to begin with the earliest examples of color printing, beginning with Furst and Schaefer between 1457 and 1462. This is an image from the Psalter that these two printers put together in 1457. And you can see there's a in black, the red initial letters are been rubricated, and then you have this large B, this initial letter that's sitting in the lower part of the page that has been printed in color. This is a sort of a detail of it, and you can see this combination of red and blue, but this filigree, this network of decorative lines that are in the border and which decorate the B, the center of the B, were printed together, although they were inked separately and then printed together with the rest of the text. This is an image that comes from the color printing book to give you some idea how this was done. So you have the block, you have the metal plate with its design on it, which is adhered to the block, and then you have the letter form, which is a separate piece, and these are put together, the print and inked separately, and then they were printed. Very laborious job, as you can imagine. This is one of the great initial letters that was produced by Fürst and Schaefer in 1459 for the Durandus. The Durandus was printed in, we know of about 80 copies of this book that exist, that have survived. They're all printed on vellum, and you can see what the vellum does with this initial letter. But the registration of this must have driven these printers crazy. It's almost perfectly inked. There's no spread of the ink. And it's one of the great initial letters that was produced, and you can see that those filigree lines that go up and down the border, how delicate they must have been to cut and then also to print. This is another example from 1462 of the Latin Bible. This was the last book that they printed with printed color initials. We see as we go along here, both in the Durandus and then in the Bible, is that they were very ambitious to begin with. In the Durandus, for instance, there's 9 initial letters. The copy in the Rosenwald collection, only 6 were printed in color. They ran out of money probably, and they ran out of steam. And I think the same thing happened here with the Bible of Mainz, printed in 1462, so that you had. The expectation was that these large initial letters would have been printed throughout the whole text, but just about every copy that has survived has a different initial letters that were printed. It just suggests the difficulty of printers to be able to produce such delicate and exacting work. This is another close-up of a beautifully executed color printed initial. At the same, a little later on, the whole process of printing with multiple blocks was originated by Rathold in combination in the 1490s with Hans Bergmeier and then Johann Schott in Strasbourg. So I'm going to look at some of the examples of the work that they did. This is an edition of Sacrobusto's Sfera Mundi. It was printed in Venice in 1485. Rathold was from Augsburg. He moved to Venice in 1476. He produced 2 really fabulous books, the Calendar in 1476 and then the Euclid in 1482. Very important books in the history of printing, books which have been copied certainly for generations of printers. In this case, it's the first example of color-printed diagrams within a text. It's printed. It was 3 blocks. The first block is your block, the black printed, followed by the brown blocks and then the red blocks. And so you've got a 3-block printing process here where each of the blocks is inked separately and then printed. And you can see again that one of the issues that printers were having to deal with is a registration problem. And you can see over on the right side that the brown hasn't fit exactly in that space. And those are issues that printers are continuously dealing with, I'm sure even today, and I think Russell may even talk about it a little later. But this was the first example from 1485. This is another example of a color-printed book by Rathold. And the reason I chose this example is because I wanted to talk about the ink in this case, because how evenly it's applied. It's almost like a film layer of ink. You can see the registration problems that exist, but nonetheless, there's an even application of color. And this is one of the benefits of using blocks, and one of the characteristics of using blocks that were printed with color. In 1486, he moved back to Augsburg. He hooked up in a partnership of sorts with Hans Bergmeier, the artist, and he moved from dealing with scientific diagrams to doing narratives. And Bergmeier was the artist who helped him make that transition. And so in this case, you've got this is a 4-color printed image, the black obviously, but also the red and the two tones of brown. What's interesting about this is that this time in the 1490s, that the woodcut, working a woodcut, scoring the woodcut, creating hatching, gave a volume or gave the opportunity to the printer to make an image which was more realistic to the human body or the draping of garments. And you can see how effective that worked here, even though the plain color, it's one tone, but by scoring the board, scoring the wood, it gives a texture to the vestments and the garments in the image. This is another printer, Johann Schott, who was working in Strasbourg. First person to do in a chiaroscuro style woodblock. What he did in this case is that he made his border, but he printed the tone block of red first. And what he did is he worked the tone block by cutting and taking flakes out of that block. And so there was no ink that would accumulate in that area, and when he printed it, you would see white, so that you get another tone quality that comes through the block. Can you see that there? And then the second block was the key block, which was all black, and they were able to put into that border work around the title. So it's a two-block operation. One was strictly a tone block, and then a key block. This is another work by Schott, 1513. Important first map of Lorraine, but also a very important example. And this is another example of the same image that has a much more detailed color, so that you can give you a suggestion of that the printers were making different examples for different books. This book is from the Geography and Map Division, and the other one was from the Rosenwald collection. I want to jump here a little bit to the chiaroscuro printing, where we look at Cranach and Bergmeyer, and then move to Italy and look at Ugo de Capri and Beccafumi and Rainey. This is a print that was made by Lucas Cranach in 1507. And what he was attempting to do here is he was attempting to duplicate in a mechanical process chiaroscuro drawings that were so popular at the time, and there was a great movement to collect this type of material, and so he wanted to be able to try and do this through the process of printing. So what he did is he prepared paper. In other words, he colored his paper with a blue wash, and then he did it in a pattern so that it wasn't consistent. It wasn't just a straight color blue, so that it gave texture to the background. And then he, in certain areas, he removed the blue so that the white paper became another element of the highlight of this image. Then, with the first block, he printed black, and he printed the image of St. George and the dragon, and then the background. And then he followed it with a second block, and the second block had adhesive on it. Adhesive was put into places where he wanted it, and then he used gold fleck, a powder of sorts, metallic powder of gold, to be able to highlight this print. I think this is the only example that has survived. I don't know if you know, but I think it's the only example that survived. I think in Cleveland. It's a really beautiful, beautiful example. From Cranach, we go back to Bergmeyer. Bergmeyer had worked with Rathold, and he did the same, some of the same steps that Cranach had used. He used prepared paper, and he made the tone of the paper change from top to bottom. He printed his block in black, which is the portrait of Maximilian I and the horse and the architectural background. And instead of using powdered fleck, he made inks of metallic substance and color. So another block in the process where the highlights were from printed ink as opposed to the fleck that was used by Cranach. And in a sense, what Bergmeyer did in creating prints like this was establish the process of the two process, and then it would go to 3 and 4 blocks, as we will see. We moved to Italy, to Ugo de Carpi, 1525, this design. And in 1516, de Carpi went before the Senate in Venice and petitioned for the right to print chiaro and scuro, so from light to dark. And this was how the term was applied to the chiaroscuro printing. But if you take a look at this, you can see that he's using the same tones or the same color with more intense tones through the block. So he's got three tones of this sort of brown, various levels of intensity. And then his final block is the key block, is the black block, which brings it all together and produces a very striking image of diogeny. This is one of the great examples of chiaroscuro printing. I'll show you another example here above the Carpi design. What's interesting about this is you can see coming from your upper and left, you can see the motion of the color, the changes in the color, the use of the paper to white to highlight much of this image, and so that you have this movement from light to dark or from dark to light, depending on where you begin. But the first blocks are always the lightest tone blocks, and then they're built up with more intense color. What's interesting about this example is it's printed in 1609. It was cut probably in 1630. And so it gives you a sense of the life of some of these blocks, especially some of Ugo de Carpi, and being printed in the 17th century by Andriani. This block, if you were to analyze it very closely, you would see where some of the cracks are and where its wear is, but it still holds up after nearly 80 years. Domenico, artist who came to the medium of the wood block, and what's so powerful about this image is the vitality in which he instills in this design, and this is really a painterly attribution that he brings to his wood blocks. But by examining the blocks, at least from what I have never examined the blocks, obviously, but by examining the image, there's a vigor that Beccafumi also brought to the cutting of the block. He was one of the few artists who also cut their own blocks. If you look at the background and you can see that bold tone of red, he scored that block in many, many ways. And to begin, it almost looks like a prepared paper, but it's all printed ink. And then you can see this sweep of light to dark as from your right flowing down to the left, the flow of light and the intensity of color coming from light to dark. So it's a very good example of what the artists were attempting to achieve during this, attempting to achieve with the chiaroscuro print. This I wanted to show you because it's such a sweet example. Great example of just a two-block print, so that you've got the original color would be applied to this paper. So you've got this nice sort of pale green. That block had been scored so that the highlights jump off the page where the white gives highlights to this image, and then it's banged with a black block, the second block, where the image is then created around the original block. This was done by, the design was by Guido Reni, and it was cut by Bartolomeo Coriolano in 1630. It's just, I think this is a very fine example of just a two-block process and how successful it could be under the right conditions. At this time, theories of color were beginning to float through the scientific community, and I just want to talk about two examples. Al-Hazani was an 11th century mathematician working in the Middle East, and he did a manuscript on optics in the 11th century. It was translated in the 12th century into Latin, where copies circulated throughout Europe. And then finally in Basel in 1572, it was printed. What's interesting about Al-Hazan's book is that he's really not coming up with a unified theory of color. We'd have to wait to Newton for that. But he comes at as a condition or a quality of light. And so he's analyzing, in this case, in this part of the book, how the eye perceives light, and that how color, because color is a property of light, can be perceived by the eye. I can't go into it much deeper than that, but it's one of the earliest works to try and understand color and perception. We had to wait to 1704 until Newton published his Optics to really get a unified theory of color. He'd been working on this from the 1680s, didn't publish his manuscript until some of the opponents to his theories had passed away, and then he rushed it to print in 1704. But essentially why this book is important to printers is that he established this idea of primary colors, 3 primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, and that all other colors are the association of these prime colors together. And so this is obviously a very important piece of work for color printing in the 18th century. It sort of gave ideas to some of the printers that were to come. But before going to the 18th century, I just want to give these examples of Johann Tyler, Rotterdam in the 1680s and 1690s. And this is an example that was in the Rosenwald collection that had 55 examples of Tyler's work. There's another book like this that's at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and another one museum that have examples of Tyler's work, but it's quite rare and very revealing, actually. So Tyler's working with one plate, it's a single plate, and he's coloring his images what we came to be known as in the a la poupée method, which is he made his print, he cut it, he prepared his plate, and then he applied color by hand into all these sections of the engraving. And you can see in this example how he's applied the various colors of red, and then as you move down the back end of the feathers, you can see how the red then melds into green. So he's made that application of 2 color there, and then throughout the rest of the image, he's applying very meticulously his reds and his greens. This is an example of a landscape that he produced around in the early 1490s. Here's another example of a landscape. And this is an interesting example from my point of view because it demonstrates the difficulty of getting your color right. So that with the application of the color to the plate, you can see the right side of the tree. It's a little muddy there. The distinguished nature of the tree is sort of lost. And you look in the foreground on the left, on the right, I'm sorry, how muddy that becomes. Yeah, that's interesting. We could change the color. Are there any artists in the room?
There you go. Finger paint to your...
Great, thank you. That was good. I want that program. So to get back to Tyler, so you can see some of the difficulties that the artists and the printers were facing as they were using the medium of copper to produce a single copper plate color print. This is some of the 2 of the portraits he colored. These are really good examples, so that you can see landscape is was very important to Tyler as well as portraiture. He worked very hard on trying to produce fine images using the color printing process with a single copper plate. Moving on to multiple copper plates, we'll look at Leblanc and Gautier d'Agati and Lucentio. Leblanc came to London in the first quarter of the 18th century, and he was the first really to adopt Newton's theory of color and mixing colors in order to create different hues. And this is his text, and you can see under the preliminaries there, he's mixing red and yellow to create orange, red and blue to create purple or violet, blue and yellow to create a green color. So he's taking this idea that was in the atmosphere after the publication of Newton's book, and he's applying it. He's applying it to the printing process. What Leblanc also does is, instead of using a single plate, he's using either 3 or 4 plates in order to produce his image. This is from the Colorito. It's a description of the various colors that he was using, that his palette that he used in the production of his images. Here is an example of 2, and it's actually 3 plates, so that you see the application of color in the first plate and the second plate, and finishing it off here with the final image with his third plate. So when you're dealing with multiple plates, registration is most critical. Not only is your understanding of color and how color is going to combine, and then how it's going to read once it's printed, but registration is a major issue. And this is a really fine example of the printer was able to combine plates in order to produce a unified color image. This is one of the most famous images by Leblanc, and obviously red was the last color that was applied to this. The last plate was the red plate, but you see how successful that use of color is in the arm of the Madonna. I mean, it's a beautiful rendering, actually, of color from a printing process. But red becomes a little bit dominant in other areas of. Although the image is very clear, it's very easy to read. It's I think a dynamic image in that sense. But again, it shows this difficulty of understanding how to balance colors when you're in the printing process, when you're doing the printing process. So he's using 3 plates, sometimes plates, and he's credited with being the inventor of the multi-plate printing process. There was a book that was published in 1756 by Mortadorge about the printing of prints, and he in fact describes in this book Leblanc's techniques, and there was the palette again, and now these are the tools that were used by the engraver in that process of producing his images. We jump to Gautier d'Agouti. Gautier d'Agouti is probably the most well-known color printer of the period. His ethics apparently weren't so great, but his skills as an artist will be demonstrated in a second, but he was considered a very successful color printer. He tried to more than suggest, that he was the inventor of the process for Leblanc for a while in 1738, so we know that he learned the process there, but nonetheless, he produced some extraordinary prints. Now I'm showing you his botanical work because it's extremely rare, and it's a book, it's only 2 copies of this in America, and so it's a you won't have an opportunity to see again. But you can see how effective he is in his balance of color, in how the engraving and the scoring that he makes within his plate, how it produces a density of image or a lightness of color, excuse me. And this is another example from the botanical. And this is a close-up, and this really shows you the art of the engraver, where that's a single color of purple, and the engraving is the tones of the engraving are so different depending on the quality or the amount of pressure that is applied as the lines were cut. So this is a really fine example of the work of Gautier d'Agouti and his skill. And this is from his anatomical atlas, which is probably his most famous work. What I love about this image is this movement from the face to the buttocks of light on either end, and then it's it's almost as if it works as a stop or an opening for this flayed back and illustration of the nervous system. Gautier d'Agouti's renderings of the human body are considered probably some of the finest anatomical illustrations that were ever produced. And finally, we'll talk about Carla Lucentio, who was working in Florence. He studied with Gautier d'Agouti's son. Gautier d'Agouti had 4 sons, all of whom and Lucentio studied with him, and he produced a series of images, colored images in 4-plate, using 4 plates, and this is one example. But in this work that he did, there was 144 portraits of important Italians, some artists, and some and so forth, and some clergy. But it was 144 images done in this 4-plate printing process. I think he exhausted himself, and by 1790 he had abandoned the 4-plate process and moved back actually to take on the techniques that Tyler had originated, and Lucentio finished his work by doing all his work in alla poupe. So it's all hand precision of colors, and this is just one of the great books that was produced, and you can see color is really strong here, and how this is applied by hand is a remarkable feat of registration. Here's another image, and finally this image here. So we just traveled away. I hope that that I've set the stage for some of the other speakers who will be talking about color. This is one of the great subjects, I think, and I appreciate your time and attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan. Our next speaker is Russell Merritt, who is a type designer and private press printer working in New York City. He began printing in San Francisco as a teenager before apprenticing with Peter Koch in Berkeley and Firefly Press in Somerville, Massachusetts. He set up his own press at the Center for the Book Arts, New York, in 1993, and has been printing and publishing ever since. In 1996, Russell began teaching himself to design typefaces, and we heard last night from Mark Diminution, leading to a 12-year study of letter forms before he completed his first typeface in 2008. In 2011, he began working to convert some of his type designs into new metal typefaces. Since then, he has produced 2 metal typefaces and 4 suites of metal elements. In 2009, Russell was awarded the Rome Prize in Design from the American Academy in Rome. He has been the printer-in-residence of the Press in Tuscany Alley, San Francisco, artist-in-residence at the Center for Book Arts, New York City. He is the current North American Vice Chair of the Press Book Association and a past trustee of the American Printing History Association. Russell's books and manuscripts are in public and private collections throughout the world. The title of Russell's talk is Color in the Modern Fine Press Artist Book, which I would also note there is a version of this in the exquisite catalog that has been produced for this exhibit. Please welcome Russell Merritt.
Something else. And then this for, yeah. Thank you. Continue the day's tradition of thanking Jean-Francois, Roger, and Lynn. Jean-Francois has been a great friend and a very great supporter of my work, and it's so much fun to be here with everybody, celebrating him and Roger, and as I say in all events like this, I just love all of you. It's so great to come here and be surrounded by friends or future friends, and we all love books. So without much further ado, I'll get right into it. I guess that should have said in the contemporary fine press, but whatever. So for most of its history, the Anglo-American fine press has self-consciously placed itself in the lineage of the great typographic book. And if you consider the accepted typographic canon, you cannot help but notice a stark lack of color. if you run through the list of names, Gutenberg, Swinheim and Penartz, Jensen, Aldus, de Colline, Estienne, Fournier, Baskerville, Bedoni, etc., what comes to mind is whitish paper printed in black ink. Any color in these books other than the occasional bit of red was typically added by hand after the fact, and even then, about the second quarter of the 16th century. After that point, the typographic book set about perfecting the monochrome, and by the turn of the 19th century, the finest typographic books can most colorfully be described as meditations on the subtleties of gray. To give a few visuals that I had easily at hand, here's Aldus's 1502 printing of Ovid, and you can see there's a space left in the upper left-hand corner for the owner to have a colorful initial put in, and like most books that have come down to us, the owner didn't bother, because the I is there. Don't need it. Here's 1772 Baskerville printing of Catullus and Friends, and then a page from Giambattista Bedoni's Manuale Tipografico from 1818. Now, as Dan showed, there was plenty of color going on. These startling images of poor William and even poorer Robert Blake, and all the things we've seen from Dan. And the work of scholars like Elizabeth Savage, who wrote a big part of that book that Dan showed, is changing our chromatic understanding of early printing. But the fact remains that color did not figure prominently in the typographic books of the hand press era. Most of the things Dan showed were art. They weren't in the great typographic books. But then suddenly everything changed. The generational shift that occurred in the early 19th century is well illustrated by comparing two books published in 1818. Giambattista Bedoni's seminal type specimen Manuale Tipografico, and Alois Senefelder's Manual on Lithography, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce. It's hard to imagine two more perfectly opposed works or a cleaner break in technological and graphic approach. Bedoni's Manuale stood out as a monument to the graven black line of the past, whereas Senefelder's heralded a new era of expressive gesture, shortly to be enhanced by the addition of color. And the introduction of lithography, paired with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, led to typographic and lithographic printers engaging in a kind of commercial gambit of one-upmanship throughout the 19th century, producing increasingly dazzling works of color printing. One of the reasons they were able to do this was because industrial methods made registration much easier. Those rat-dolt printings in the 19th century, you just would have closed your eyes and turned on the press, and it would have been perfect. And the works that came out of it were just amazing. I have some images here from Charles Derrier's 62 specimen album. This is all chromotypographic work. So these are all metal pieces put together, printed in register, perfect register, and they're just absolutely dazzling. And then, of course, you can't discuss 19th century color printing without bringing up this specimen of chromatic wood type. But for all of their excitement, these pieces of printing did not offer many avenues for progress for the typographic book. There were again many exceptions. The books of William Pickering come vibrantly to mind as those that used color to advance the aims of an ostensibly text-based work. But in general, the engine that powered the chromographic printer was trade rather than literature, and each step forward in industrial printing seemed to take one step further away from the traditional book. As a consequence, excessive color came to be seen as yet another pernicious symptom of industrialism, all splash and no substance. And when toward the end of the century the British private press stepped in to staunch the typographic wound, they threw the chromatic baby out with the industrial bathwater. After its brief Victorian fluorescence, fine printing took on the pre-industrial guise, black first of all, with occasional red, blue, and in the case of Ashendene gold, as seen in the Kelmscott Chaucer, which I would just say, he's much maligned, William Morris. I think everyone in this room should take a little closer I love this book. Not all early 20th or turn of the 20th century fine printers were so quick to dismiss the 19th century's chromatic progress, however. Lucian Pissaro's multi-chromatic wood engravings in his Aragni Press and Charles Ricketts' Vale Press books used 19th century color overlay techniques to great effect, while on the continent, printers like Francois-Louis Schmid used color with dazzling abandon. This is just one of the most amazing books ever printed. Ward Ritchie said the title page involved 45 wood-engraved blocks and took Schmid 2 months to print. Just the title page. And he's my kind of man. And this is a spread, 2 facing pages from that same book. Just unbelievable. But the important distinction between printers such as Pissarro and Schmid and the more chromatically austere Kelmscott, Doves, Ashendene, and Golden Cockerel presses is that Pissarro and Schmid were visual artists who made books, whereas the Kelmscott, Doves, Ashendene, and Golden Cockerel were presses that were primarily motivated by the typographic page. These traditions developed throughout the 20th century in varying degrees of isolationism, ultimately calcifying into the frustratingly imprecise dichotomy of fine press on the one side and artist books on the other. And as with any such attempt of classifying diverse works into limited categories, the guiding metric for determining whether a book belonged to the fine or the artist camp usually came down to you know it when you see it. And the one principal way in which you knew it when you saw it was how much color was in the book. And it has only been in the last 60 years or so that the divisions between these two traditions have blurred into the surprisingly accurate, albeit clumsy, appellation of the fine press artist book. Books in which typography, color, image, medium, material, and structure all receive equal footing. And now I know what you're asking yourself. What happened 60 years ago that made this change possible? Well, Claire Van Vliet happened. This is the first page of a Google search. It's just Claire Van Vliet books. Compare it to the great monument of the 20th century private press, and it's just incredible. I mean, it's just amazing. Color is everywhere present in Van Vliet's Janus Press books. It is printed, painted, applied. It pops up, shimmies, and shifts as her book's structures change through turning. But despite her chromatic maximalism, the color in Van Vliet's books is always sensitively related to the content of the text. The color is, in fact, content. It works with the typography, binding, and materials to create singular books. But what distinguishes Janus Press books from those of most other presses, is the sheer variety of techniques employed to bring color into the book. Whereas most printers tend to concentrate on a few media or techniques, Van Vliet draws on nearly every available media to realize her vision. And of those media, there are 3 primary methods for getting color on a page: by hand, by press, and by paper or substrate. And there are endless subdivisions within these categories, but for the purpose of the present exhibition, the list can be pared down somewhat. Hand processes include printing and pochoir, which is hand painting through stencils. Printing processes include typography, the printing of type or ornaments and colors, linoleum cut, wood cut, engraving on wood, metal, and resin or corian, photopolymer, printed relief or intaglio, lithography, etching, and inkjet. And substrate processes involve pulp painting, paper engineering, by which other colors are revealed, dyeing, or the choice of color papers. Each of these methods can in turn be applied with varying degrees of subtlety or flamboyance to produce a remarkable variety of results. And there are too many books in the exhibition to speak directly to each one, but I've just chosen a representative sampling that sort of gives you an idea of these different processes. I think these 2 images of Ed's, it might be a little low res, I don't know, but you get the idea. In the books of his Haybarn Press, his hand coloring and pochoir, either in isolation or in concert with his painterly lithographs and inkjet transfers. The unifying characteristic of Coker's images is the presence of the brush. Color moves across his pages in gestural brush strokes that are beautifully counterposed by his classical graphic sensibility. Whether hand-applied or printed, Coker's images colorfully blur the distinction between print and painting, filling his books with a vibrant spectrum of color. So these are, color lithographs that then are hand-finished with pochoir coloring. This is another one of his books, Voices to Share. And drawing on similar traditions but to different result, the books of Walter Baczynski and Janice Butler's Shanty Bay Press feature classical and modernist texts, illustrated with Baczynski's brilliantly colored pochoir woodcuts and linoleum cuts. Shanty Bay Press books provide a quick study in the subtle distinctions between color that is hand-applied and color that is printed. What you can't really see here is that the green border is actually printed. The entire page is printed with a linoleum block that has a rectangle excised from it, and then Walter's pochoir is in the middle. And you can't see the difference so much here, but in the real book, there's a real tonal shift. The frame sinks into the background, and the image just leaps off the page. And this careful manipulation of these differences in tone give a special rhythm Shanty Bay's books. They project outward and draw you inward by turns. This is another one of Walter's remarkably colorful pochoir images. Now, for Ninja Press's The Intimate Stranger by Breitenbach, Carolee Campbell uses hand-applied and typographic color as both content and wayfinding device. From the outset, the book announces itself as color. It is housed in a purple enclosure that locks into place with the aid of a green triangle. And inside this housing, the book's covers are coated with a thick layer of yellow ochre and volcanic pumice, which sounds very Californian to me. As the pages are turned, color continues to appear in painted edges, printed ornaments, and stenciled shapes of thick, earthy pigments. The effect is accentuated by innovative folding and trimming that carries the reader along in a kind of chromatic hide-and-seek, as Breitenbach's text is revealed in fashion. I have a sort of slideshow or a flip book that I'll go through slowly that gives you a sense of what's going on here. That's a cut hole, and then the folding is really interesting. Again, like all good books of this nature, the folds and everything are tied fairly intimately to the content of the text. And of all the color printing techniques, typographic color is certainly the most common among presses. The printing of titling or ornaments in second or third colors is relatively easy, and it gives a lot of bang for the buck. And among typographic few use color more innovatively than Barbara Henry in her Harsimus Press books. This is one of the pages from her Theta playbook, the two gravestones printed in 4 colors, linoleum and type, and then these little Theta composed of sort of alpha block style ornaments. In nearly all of her books, there's some instance of chromatic surprise, but this shows her talents to best advantage, I think, this book to date. It involves the use of chromatic typography, ornaments, linoleum blocks, and colored paper. That we'll see here. Here again, which is made of a sort of alpha blocks approach, printed on a different color paper, with then a 2-color sort of chiaroscuro linoleum cut with the white coming through. And then the wood type printed in multiple colors as sort of, illustration of digital age typographic. Among wood engravers, Richard Wagner and Gaylord Schenelec used 2 different approaches to color in their work. Wagner, in engravings for his and other press books, will often print a rectangular block as a color ground to separate his engravings from the page. Device can produce dramatically different results. In his recent book, Vestige, Wagner printed his delicate engravings of woven fabric in mid-tone colors on top of a larger area of pale color. The color field is slightly darker than the paper on which it's printed, and it quietly frames the image on the page. If you compare that with his illustrations for Peter Koch's Parmenides, these are printed in red and black on brightly colored grounds that, sort of challenge our easy classifications of what a wood engraving can be. I mean, these are effectively wood engravings of action painting. before Richard Wagner came along, if I had said, oh, someone's doing a wood engraving of an action painting, people would have thought I was insane. I mean, it's just incredible what he has done with these. But Gaylord Chenelec, on the other hand, prints reduction wood engravings of more traditional subject matter, but he employs chromoxylographic techniques to achieve great varieties of color in his images. Chenelec's obsessive layering of color is probably best appreciated in the large-scale engravings from his recent Lac de Pleurs, in particular the engraving of the freshwater drum, which this is. In this print, there are 10 or 12 subtle overlays of color that successfully convey the image of a dead fish superimposed on top of the live specimen. And of course, of engravers using other materials, Abigail Rohrer uses traditional wood engraving techniques on her Corian block engraving. Her distinct approach to color and image uses a combination of color ground, spot colors, overlay, outline, and stippling to create dramatic colored images. Rohrer sets off each image in her book Mimpish Squinnies with a subtle color block similar to what Wagner would later use in Vestige. Whereas Wagner used the color field to frame, in Rohrer's images it sort of acts more to contain the image. Her fantastical engravings of anamorphic plants writhe in bright colors within the confines of these boundaries, nearly lifting off the page with the aid of her bold lines. This is a more subtle example of an engraving from her companion volume to Mimpish Squinnies' King of the Alps. Now, inkjet is the newest method of color printing to enter the world of fine books, and like all newcomers, it sits at the table on a probationary status. Of course, inkjet is a new technique as an art medium, but its status in the book world is partly justified by the fact that the outcome is not directly determined by the artist. You're still pushing print, and something's coming out. But with that said, there's an increasing body of fine books featuring inkjet. And chief among these, in my opinion, is Jean-Pierre Hébert's Invisible Cities, published by Editions Rees. The slide's a little dark, but on each spread of the book, Hébert's ethereal images interact with well-spaced lines of Gil Sans type, and the resulting text-image combinations are somehow anything but light, even though they're composed of very light images. They also beautifully counterpose the two media of inkjet and letterpress, as seen here. You see the highly dense, chromatic, flat inkjet print, and then the impression of the letterpress. It's just a very satisfying dimensional experience. And the final method of bringing color into a book that I'd like to discuss is that which is advanced through the book's paper or substrate. Writing and printing on a colored surface is a practice with deep historical roots, from in the purple manuscripts of Byzantium, through books like the famous Blue Koran, and on into the blue paper editions of Venetian printers. In contemporary work, the practice can be as simple as using one or more colored papers, or as complex as painting with colored paper pulp. Many of the artists whose work is included in this exhibition use one or more of these techniques in their books, but one book that distinguishes itself for its innovation is Robin Price's Love in the Time of War. Rather than paper, the book is printed on silk sheets that are individually dyed and painted, resulting in evocative gradations of color that are unique to each copy. The silk sheets are folded at the foredge, creating hidden spaces into which Price has attached color shapes. And these shapes supply another level of information that shifts and changes as the reader pages through the book. Rather than experiencing a color, the process of in the time of war is one of color experienced as it changes over time. And I have three images of this. One point that I think is very important, if it hasn't become clear from this, books are meant to be held and paged through in your hand. And these, however satisfying it be to see the work of people in exhibits and, get your hands on these books and experience them, because they are multidimensional kinetic sculptures that cannot be represented in two dimensions. That's over. And own work, I have tried to approach color printing as I would a painting, using methods of underpainting, overlay, heightening, and shading to make my images. And I'm just going to show an assortment of those because I couldn't rightfully put them in my essay in the catalog. So all of these images are printed letterpress from multiple plates. This is the T for truth from Ethelwald, etc. This is a close-up of the J for Jardin, which shows the heightening and subtle shading techniques that I'm trying to use from making pencil drawings that I convert into digital printing plates. This is the Arthur Rimbaud page from Specimens of Diverse Characters. Most of these are anywhere from 5 to 8 colors. The Alexander the Great page from the same book, in which all the pigments except the black are hand-ground inks that I make in my studio. And then the Chambered Nautilus from Interstices and Intersections. And the cubes from the same book, which are up on the display in the gallery. But the books in this exhibit bear the distinction of being created at a period of history in which the line between craft and art is blurring and breaking down. With the advent of digital technology, the burden of strict utility is steadily lifting from the physical book, allowing printers and artists to reconsider and reimagine narrative content. Similar to how photography freed painting from the need to depict, we no longer need books to slavishly serve the text. There are more efficient platforms for that end, and even for those of us who love holding a paperback in our hands, this technological change is altering the role of the codex in our lives. The handmade book, in other words, is self-evident. To exist, it requires a conceptual or aesthetic framework that goes beyond that of a textual delivery device. Among inveterate bibliophiles like myself, these changes are often cast in a negative light, as if the e-book were a flaming herald of the coming apocalypse. It might be, but until I love e-books personally, but until the apocalypse arrives, printed books, objects that call on all of our senses and in whose pages are bound up a living seam of our cultural memory, are becoming more colorful by the year. Thank you.
All right, we have 10 or 15 minutes for questions. I'm going to defer asking questions, and I'm going to open it to the floor. Please, who has a question? First question, please, Len.
Russell, how did you do that page?
Yeah.
Every time I see it, I'm just amazed, and I just...
All right, it's very simple. It's a 7-color print. One of the colors is just the black outline. So I drew those in ink on tracing paper, scanned them in, made that key block, I guess you would call it. And then I made, and I used 6 colors, so 2 different yellows, 2 different blues. So yellow ochre, Hansa yellow medium, Indian throne blue, quinacridone blue, pyrrole red, or phthalo blue, not quinacridone blue, pyrrole red and quinacridone red. And then I took a piece of tracing paper and smeared pencil graphite on it and took a little olive oil and mashed it around and scanned that and made the texture surface from that. And so what I would do is I'd print an overall texture from that drawing as a solid color underneath. And then the colors on top are just halftone screens of 10, 40, and 70%, and then printed on, and they give the dimensionality to the cubes. So
It was simple.
Pretty simple.
well, I mean, it's actually one of the most simple prints in the book.
Yes.
I was going to ask about the other one, which are the clover.
Yeah, that's the simplest one. That's just 3 plates. But there are 4 levels of depth. So the involved drawing a clover patch, then recreating the outline in Illustrator, filling that outline with 4 different densities of color. And so that's the first thing that's printed, 10, 40, 70, and 100% green. And then a clover leaf is lighter than the leaf itself, and there's a slight lightness around the edge. So what I did is I did very crude pencil drawings of the veining and the leaf edge, scanned those in, made a negative of them so that they would actually be the light, the drawing would be the light part, masked those out so they fit with the halftones that I'd printed before, printed that on top, and then to set it off I mixed a purple black, and I made 4 different depths of shadow to give the 4 different layers. And it's amazing what transpires when you just hit that black gray in there in the shadow. All of a sudden they just popped off, whereas it looked pretty muddy beforehand, honestly. You're welcome.
We have a question in the back.
This brought to mind this image and your description. In the last, say, years, and especially currently, 3D printing has really become really big, making complex instruments, I hate to say like plastic guns, I think all kinds of very intricate items you can make with 3D printing. How has the technical, I guess what they do is, of course, there's a program that you basically program your printer, and it can make all these different items. Yeah. And I would think also in 2 dimensions, you could probably program your computer and make very intricate drawings via computer in same fashion. How has that impacted this kind of printing in the last, say, few years, this new computer printing craze?
Well, there are 2 separate things going on. The creation of the visual image is done on the computer, and then the method of printing can either be through a 3D printer, which I have no experience with, or you can do what I do, which is output film negatives and make relief printing plates from the art I create. So all of the images of mine that I showed were fed, even though they involved drawing, interfaced through a computer in one way or another. And so I used digital drawing techniques, but the 3D printing has not come into it for me. There are people experimenting with making 3D printed type to print from, but it's about the least practical thing you could possibly engage in, because it just takes so long. I mean, it's just you just get a mold and shove some lead in it and you got a letter. But this is like, so yeah. But I think you will see more 3D printing used as printing surfaces in the coming years. Definitely.
Other question, Laura?
I want to thank you both for these wonderful presentations that I think fit so well together, starting with the history of this color printing and going forward. And across the 2 presentations, I was thinking about the sort of the lessons of the technology as Dan was going through his, the early people trying to just figure out how to do color printing and what that produced aesthetically. And so I was wondering if Dan could talk a little bit about what he thinks sort of people trying to deal with the limitations of the technologies at the time produced in terms of effect of early printing, but then also as an artist today, how sort of limitations of technology are helpful or difficult, or what sort of things were still challenging us when we're trying to approach this kind of production.
You first.
Yeah, I think studying the development of the woodcut and then moving forward into the 18th century and the demand for detail in the copperplate was really the driving force between the limits of using a woodcut in the 17th century. And I think I think there was a social movement that was taking place. There was an intellectual movement, a demand for detail. Coming from the scientific community in many respects during the 17th century, which demanded a different matrix in order to produce images. that's just one example, I think, of the technical limitations of working in wood. In the 19th century, obviously, when they were working in a different, instead of working on the plank, they were working on the end, you were able to develop much more detail. But in the 18th century and the 17th century, really that demand for detail that spurred the movement into the use of copper.
I've lost a little sight of the question, but the use of technology and how it affects for me, I started using the frustration. I wanted to print from my own typefaces, and then as I got more familiar with my technology that I was using to do that, I started making images using that technology. Now I'm sort of reverse engineering that process, trying to use other materials to make my images and trying to make my type more and more type. I'm working on 3 new metal typefaces now, and trying to make more metal type so that I can use metal type rather than. So I think that's just an example of that. Go to technology out of necessity, like you go to the engraving because you need more detail, you go to the computer because you can get what you want, and yeah, I guess that's the end of my thought on that.
Other Well, I will pose one to Dan. Dan, yes, you've given us a promo for the new book on color printing, but in your estimation, what remains to be heard about the history of early color printing?
I think the more that we have access to hidden archives, mostly manuscript archives, that the information that we're going to learn about early printing and early attempts at combining art and printing, I think will give us a lot more information about the types of lives that people lived and the types of techniques that they were struggling with. I think one of the things I'm seeing is this whole movement to digitize and tag 16th and 17th century manuscripts, which at the moment are mostly literary and historical, but I think in the future that more archives are going to be examined in this fashion. And it's going to provide, I think it's going to open up a whole new way of seeing how people live their lives and how printers worked or how businesses were run. So I think that's how I would see it.
Thank you. Question here.
The progress from single color to multiple color and then to the chromolithography in Sennefelder seems to be a duplication that's happening at the present time with the traditional methods that were abandoned by the technology of the time, that is, individuals that can get letterpress cheaply, created as their art form, now expanding through the computer. And so I'm seeing a duplication of the history of the entire history of color and printing with the technological uses at the present time, particularly yourself, Russell. Do you have any musings on that duplication of past at the present time? That is, your particular use of the computer. This is not that which has been thrown away, but that which you are utilizing to its fullest extent.
Well, I think the exciting thing about the Industrial Revolution was that all of a sudden things were possible on the page that had not been possible prior to that. For me, I can't paint. I can't write a nice-looking letter form. But on the computer, I can. I mean, and so I figure out, so I'm using the technology that's available today to go beyond what my capabilities are without that technology. I mean, I guess that would be the similarity. And so I can really take like the drawings for interstices and intersections are really just smudges of graphite on, But through the computer and through what I can do on the printing press, I can turn that into a picture of a nautilus shell. Yeah.
But a lot of things that were happening in the letterpress movement starting in the 60s really does follow McLuhan's concept that when a technology is no longer possible, it's a that becomes an art form.
Right.
But now you're accepting that which is not obsolete and working it into your traditional methods. And that's
Well, the example people love to bring up about that is that, William Morris used photographic technology in his work. And, he wasn't writing essays about that and wasn't about that at the Guild of Art Workers, but he was sure as hell was using it. So I think if we can learn anything from contemporary society is that no one is pure.
I'm not speaking of purity, though.
No, I know, but I mean, I just think that things don't happen in isolation. It's like the people love to talk about how letterpress is dead, and there's no way in hell it's dead. I mean, we're living in one of the most exciting periods of letterpress book production in the history of printing, and so I think there's always been, more interchange between trade and art than either side, the art side has liked to admit, and yeah, I guess that's that.
There's time for one more question. Going one. Dan, what's your favorite color?
Dan.
I think I'm in the blue range myself.
Blue range?
Yeah.
Right on.
Right. I would tend to go with Robin Price's answer, but from the perspective of color printing, yellow is most important. And I love yellow.
Let us thank our two speakers for their superb